You cut power to my ICU
It's
room?
on rolls.
Too late, watch this. Ma'am, step back.
No, this can't be happening. Start the generator now.
On it! Hurry, get it powered up.
Connect the hoses.
It's running. Good.
A quiet life on Maplewood Lane. I had always believed in the quiet rhythm of Maplewood Lane. Nestled in the heart of a suburban neighborhood where perfectly trimmed lawns met the soft hum of sprinklers in the morning, my house was more than a home. It was a sanctuary. From the moment I opened my eyes, sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting warm golden stripes across the living room floor. The hum of my oxygen concentrator was barely audible over the morning birdsong, a steady reminder of both fragility and life. I had built a routine around these small, dependable things. Breakfast at exactly 7, a call to my doctor every Wednesday, my favorite jazz playlist filling the corners of the kitchen. I cherished these small comforts, especially in a world where unpredictability had become the quiet undercurrent of daily life. My neighbors, for the most part, were cordial. Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez, 2 doors down, would wave as they carried their groceries inside. On weekends, the Johnson kids rode their bikes, laughter echoing against the brick facades, a sound I had grown to associate with safety. But safety, as I was beginning to learn, is a delicate illusion. It began subtly. The first warning signs came in the form of a neatly typed letter, slid under my door while I slept. The HOA had a knack for these little surprises, a reminder that our pristine streets came with invisible boundaries. Please remove the potted plants from the walkway. It read. Harmless, I thought at first. A minor infraction, perhaps a misunderstood guideline. I moved the plants to the side of the porch, smiling at the absurdity of being reprimanded for a row of geraniums. Even then, there was something in the tone that didn't sit right. The typeface was sharp, almost clinical, as if the words themselves were meant to slice through comfort. And the signature at the bottom, a single name scrawled with deliberate neatness, Karen. HOA Karen, as the neighborhood would soon know her, though at the time she was just another resident, an enforcer of rules I hadn't even realized were so rigid. The community itself was a tapestry of contrasts, though on the surface it appeared homogeneous. Maplewood Lane was predominantly white, and while that was not unusual for the region, the subtle racial dynamics were impossible to ignore. As one of the few black residents on the street, I had always sensed a quiet distance in certain interactions, a polite nod instead of a smile, a conversation that lingered just long enough to be cordial but never genuine. It wasn't overt hostility. It was subtler, woven into the fabric of casual glances and polite corrections when I trimmed my hedges too close to the sidewalk. I often wondered if it was paranoia, but small incidents piled together in a way that made them hard to ignore. The Alvarezes, who were usually friendly, once remarked half-jokingly, "Maplewood Lane is for people who follow the rules carefully." I laughed, but inside a tight knot formed in my stomach. Was it really just about rules, or was it something deeper, a coded message about who belonged and who didn't? Still, my life continued in its measured cadence. I worked from home, managing a small graphic design business that allowed me to keep my health as my first priority. My home office looked out onto the street, where I could see every passerby without stepping outside. I liked the control that brought, the ability to observe without being too observed. It was during one of these quiet mornings that the first real ripple appeared. A neighbor's dog barked incessantly, a nuisance more than a threat, and I decided to investigate. As I stepped onto my porch, I noticed a figure standing across the street. A woman in a crisp polo shirt and khakis, clipboard in hand. Her expression was sharp, her eyes scanning every detail with unnerving precision. She waved, but it wasn't warm. It was a wave of authority. A silent reminder that every inch of this street was monitored, measured, and judged. And so the seeds of unease were planted, though I didn't yet realize how fast they would grow. That small encounter, a mere glance from HOA Karen, felt inconsequential in the morning light. Yet, beneath the warmth of routine and the soft hum of my medical equipment, a subtle tension began to coil. Maplewood Lane was not as peaceful as it appeared. And in that moment, I couldn't have known that my sanctuary was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would challenge everything I thought I knew about safety, authority, and the people around me. The first ripples of trouble. For a few weeks after that morning encounter with HOA Karen, life on Maplewood Lane seemed unchanged. The sun still poured through my windows in golden shafts, The Johnson kids still rode their bikes in dizzying circles around the cul-de-sac, and my morning playlist still carried the soft hum of jazz into the corners of my home office. Yet, beneath the familiar rhythm, I began to notice the faint threads of unease weaving into my days. It started small, almost laughably so. A notice slid under my door, this time about the height of my hedges. Apparently, they obstructed the sidewalk and created a safety hazard. I had trimmed them carefully, according to every guideline I could find in the HOA rulebook. But rules, as I was learning, were flexible when interpreted by someone like Karen. Her handwriting, sharp, precise, and unyielding, left no room for discussion. She did not ask. She instructed. At first, I felt a quiet annoyance, the kind that dissolves if ignored. But then other neighbors started behaving differently around me. Mr. Alvarez stopped waving. Mrs. Alvarez's smiles became tight and polite, almost rehearsed. Even the kids on their bikes hesitated when they passed my driveway. These were small gestures, almost imperceptible, but they built a cumulative weight that pressed on me every time I walked through my front door. Maplewood Lane, I realized, was a neighborhood divided by subtle, invisible lines. On the surface, it was immaculate, picture-perfect. White picket fences, freshly painted mailboxes, and lawns so meticulously manicured that stepping off the sidewalk felt like trespassing into a curated museum. Yet underneath the polished veneer lay tension and exclusion. It wasn't overt racism, not in the way headlines screamed, but it was there, woven into sidelong glances, clipped conversations, and the quiet policing of who truly belonged. And now it seemed I was under scrutiny. Every delivery, every visitor, every small deviation from the prescribed way of life drew attention. The mailman's cheerful nod faltered when I answered the door. My friend who came to visit my small office hesitated as she set her bag down, glancing nervously toward Karen's house across the street. It was subtle, like a shadow that follows your steps. A quiet reminder that I was being watched. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long orange streaks across the asphalt, I noticed Karen herself patrolling the street. Clipboard in hand, she moved deliberately, almost theatrically, stopping in front of houses, inspecting yards, counting cars and driveways. When she reached mine, she paused. Not a word, not a knock, just a long calculating stare. I met her eyes from my window and felt a shiver creep down my spine. She turned, continuing her rounds, but the feeling of being measured, judged, and found wanting lingered like a heavy fog. It was during one of these rounds that a neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, stopped to chat. She was older, kind-eyed, and perhaps the only person who had ever approached me without reservation. "Karen's taken things a little far lately, hasn't she?" she murmured, glancing toward the enforcing figure in khakis. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Thompson sighed. "It's complicated. People here like things neat and controlled. And some of us, well, we've learned to stay quiet." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left. Stay quiet. I understood the meaning. It wasn't just advice. It was a warning. Speaking up could be dangerous, disruptive, or worse, socially isolating. But staying quiet felt like surrender. And I wasn't ready to give up the sanctuary I had built. The tension escalated incrementally. Small HOA notices piled on top of one another. A complaint about a flag displayed incorrectly, a note about a trash can left too long at the curb, a polite, but pointed, reminder to maintain the driveway in a uniform color scheme. Every note carried the same undertone. Compliance was expected, individuality was punished. And though the community's polish masked hostility, it was impossible to ignore. The walls of this neighborhood were built on appearances, and my very presence threatened that facade. Late one night, as I sat on my porch sipping chamomile tea and listening to the gentle hum of my oxygen concentrator, I realized that something had shifted. The neighborhood that had once felt like a safe harbor now felt like a stage, and I had been cast as an unwitting antagonist. And while the disturbances had been small, harmless even, the pattern was unmistakable. Karen was not just enforcing rules. She was asserting control, testing boundaries, and I was squarely in her sights. Beneath the calm surface of Maplewood Lane, a storm was brewing. The sun would rise again tomorrow, the lawns would gleam, and the neighbors would continue their routines. But the quiet life I had treasured was already fracturing, and I could sense the moment when routine would snap, revealing the tension that had been lurking just out of sight. The line between rules and control. Days bled into weeks, and the tension that had once been subtle began to press on every corner of my life. The early morning hum of my oxygen concentrator, once a comforting reminder of stability, now sounded like a metronome counting down to some inevitable confrontation. Maplewood Lane, which I had once considered a haven, started to feel like a stage where I was being judged, measured, critiqued, and perhaps punished. Karen's presence grew more insistent. The letters had evolved into in-person inspections. She'd appear on the sidewalk without warning, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning every detail of my property. One morning she stood near the edge of my driveway, peering at the small satellite dish I had installed to keep my work online. "That's not allowed," she said, her tone light but final, as if this small offense justified her intrusion into my life. I tried to explain that the dish was essential for my freelance work, that it didn't violate any official rule. She shook her head. "Rules are rules," she said, as if that alone settled the matter, and then walked away without another word. I noticed how neighbors reacted to her visits. The Alvarez family waved politely but kept their distance. The Johnson kids biked a little slower past my house, eyes downcast. Even Mrs. Thompson, usually a voice of quiet support, hesitated before approaching me, her words clipped with caution. The racial undertones of these interactions were no longer subtle. The warmth of human connection, the simple smile, the friendly wave, was filtered through fear or judgment, and I felt the weight of being different on this perfectly manicured street. Then came the day the first real disruption hit. It started innocuously, almost comically. A complaint about my garden hose left on the lawn overnight. I had run out briefly to water the small flower bed by the porch, and in that short span, Karen had noticed, noted, and documented the violation. When she knocked on my door that afternoon, I opened it cautiously, already anticipating her scolding. But what she said stunned me. "You need to understand that your disregard for the rules affects everyone," she said, her eyes cold, scanning my home as though it belonged to her rather than me. "We keep this neighborhood orderly for a reason. Everyone expects it. Don't make exceptions for yourself." Her words weren't just about a hose, they were about control. About the unspoken expectation that I, and others who didn't quite fit the neighborhood mold, would conform quietly without question. That realization hit me harder than any direct confrontation could. It wasn't about rules, it was about asserting dominance over someone who dared to live differently. Later that evening, as I sat in my home office, I noticed the subtle signs of a neighborhood watch in effect. Lights flicked on and off in homes across the street at odd intervals, cars slowed suspiciously as they passed, and every minor delivery to my house was met with hushed whispers. The pressure wasn't just on me, it was a silent instruction to the entire street. Conform, observe, and never challenge the status quo. Despite this, I tried to maintain normalcy. My morning coffee tasted the same, my work routine remained intact, and the hum of the concentrator continued its steady pulse. But the fractures were becoming impossible to ignore. Each day I felt the invisible lines that divided the community grow sharper, more rigid, more suffocating. The calm life I had cherished was slipping away, replaced by the constant vigilance that Karen's presence demanded. The final straw came one afternoon when I returned from a short walk. My driveway was blocked by a moving truck, a minor inconvenience, except that Karen had called it in, claiming that I had an unauthorized vehicle obstructing the street. The driver, confused but polite, explained the complaint had come from an HOA resident. Karen appeared moments later, clipboard in hand, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in her expression. The truck's engine rumbled, filling the street with low vibrations. Karen froze as she realized that her authority had limits, that real-world consequences, the generator of life and utility, could not be checked by mere paperwork or intimidation. It was a small victory, almost symbolic, but it underscored the growing divide between the superficial order Karen enforced and the reality of life on Maplewood Lane. I felt a flicker of hope. Even in a neighborhood ruled by appearances, there were cracks in her control, and in those cracks lay the chance for justice, or at least survival. But deep down I knew this was only the beginning. The minor disputes, the small inspections, the coded glances, they were all leading somewhere. A confrontation I could already sense looming on the horizon. Maplewood Lane was no longer just a peaceful street. It had become a battleground, and I was squarely in the crosshairs. When rules meet reality, The morning started like any other. Sunlight spilling through the blinds, my oxygen concentrator humming steadily in the corner, and the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the kitchen. But the peace that had defined Maplewood Lane was gone, replaced by a heavy, almost electric tension. The small disturbances that had once seemed trivial, the letters, the inspections, the silent judgment, were no longer minor. They had snowballed into something far more dangerous. It happened suddenly. A sharp click echoed through the house, and the lights flickered. My concentrator sputtered, then went silent. Panic seized me. I was acutely aware of every second that passed without power. My life, dependent on electricity, was suddenly precarious. I rushed to the windows, heart pounding, only to see her. Karen standing across the street, clipboard in hand, her expression unflinching. She hadn't expected this, I realized. She hadn't anticipated the real consequences of her rules enforcement. Neighbors gathered slowly, drawn by the sudden commotion. Some whispered, others pointed, but Karen remained frozen, the embodiment of authority undone by circumstance. A truck arrived next, a city generator crew, flashing lights and low rumble announcing their presence. The driver jumped out, checking connections, assessing the outage. Karen's rigid composure faltered as she watched them work, realizing her power was meaningless in the face of necessity and life itself. As the generator roared to life, my concentrator resumed its steady hum. Relief washed over me, almost overwhelming in its intensity. But it wasn't just about survival, it was a statement. Authority on paper could not override reality, and for the first time the people around us could see it. Murmurs ran through the street. A few neighbors clapped quietly, others looked on in astonishment, and Karen simply stared, her clipboard dangling at her side. The veneer of control had cracked, revealing the vulnerability beneath. The racial dynamics of the neighborhood were undeniable in that moment. Some neighbors averted their eyes, perhaps recognizing how easily power and prejudice could intersect. Others offered silent support, small gestures of solidarity that had been missing for months. I realized that the true fault lines weren't just about rules, they were about who we assumed could enforce them, and who was assumed to follow without question. As I settled back into my chair, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline, I reflected on the weeks that had led here. The minor inspections, the coded glances, the persistent tension, all of it had been a rehearsal for this confrontation. The neighborhood's polished surface had hidden deeper fractures, assumptions about race, class, and authority that could twist everyday interactions into a theater of control. Karen eventually moved, retreating back into her house, her authority diminished in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed the generator's arrival. I could see the realization in her posture, the understanding that life and human need cannot be dictated solely by rules on paper or personal vendettas. It was a small victory, yes, but a decisive one. Neighbors approached cautiously after the initial shock. Mrs. Thompson offered a quiet smile, perhaps acknowledging my resilience in a world that had often expected me to remain unseen. The Johnson kids waved timidly, as if sensing the shift in balance. Even the Alvarez family, who had once maintained polite distance, lingered a little longer, perhaps reconsidering their own assumptions about who truly belonged here. I spent the rest of the day ensuring my equipment functioned properly, checking every connection, every outlet, with a renewed sense of vigilance. But the generator's roar had given me more than safety. It had given me a sense of agency. The street, once a symbol of judgment and restriction, had revealed its capacity for reality to intervene. Rules could dictate appearances, but life itself had the final say. By evening, the sun set over Maplewood Lane in long streaks of orange and purple, painting the neighborhood in a peaceful glow that belied the day's tension. I sat on my porch, inhaling the familiar scent of freshly mowed lawns and distant barbecue smoke, feeling a quiet triumph. The battle had not been against Karen alone. It had been against the subtle, pervasive forces that sought to limit who I could be, what I could do, and where I belonged. And in that moment, I realized that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the resilience to survive and thrive despite it. The street returned to its polished, picture-perfect appearance by nightfall. Yet beneath the perfection, everyone who had watched the events unfold carried a lesson. Power is fleeting, control is fragile, and the human capacity for empathy and action is stronger than any clipboard or HOA rule. And for me, that knowledge was the truest form of victory.